Good afternoon, and welcome. Good afternoon and welcome to the 2014-15 Bannon Institute on Ignatian Leadership. My name is Mick McCarthy, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Ignatian Center here. This year, as many of you know, we will be exploring the theme of leadership, taking our inspiration from the spirituality of St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. Ignatian leadership, however, is not always wanted. In the year 1773, Pope Clement XIV shut us down. The suppression lasted a few decades until 1814, that's 200 years ago if you're counting, when Pope Pius VII restored the Society of Jesus. The current Superior General of the Jesuits, Father Adolfo Nicolas, has indicated that the celebration of the 200th anniversary of the restoration of the Society should be an occasion for us to reflect. He writes, and I quote, "All the crises of history enclose a hidden wisdom that needs to be fathomed. For us Jesuits, this is the commemoration of our greatest crisis. It is therefore important that we should learn from it." The story of the suppression and restoration of the Society of Jesus is a rich one to tell, and we are happy to welcome someone who can tell that rich story quite well. Father Thomas Lucas is currently University Professor and Rector of the Jesuit Community at Seattle University. He received his doctorate in Theology and the Arts at the GTU in Berkeley. He also holds degrees from the Gregorian in Rome, from Fordham in New York, the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, and Santa Clara University, where we are right now. He is an internationally recognized expert in Jesuit art history. Early in his career, perhaps most interestingly, early in his career, Father Lucas designed and directed the restoration of the 16th century rooms of St. Ignatius in Rome. Those are the rooms where the actual person Ignatius lived and worked. And he curated an exhibit on Jesuit architecture at the Vatican Library. In the course of that work, he also edited and designed the exhibit catalog, Saint, Site, and Sacred Strategy. His book, Landmarking City, Church, and Jesuit Urban Strategy, won an Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities National Book Award in 2000. We're pleased that he has come down here to the Valley of the Heart's Delight from the Great Northwest to deliver a lecture aptly titled, A Jesuit Tragicomedy in 2 Acts and an Interlude, the Suppression and Restoration Controversy. Please welcome Father Lucas.
Thank you, Mitch. Thank you. It's wonderful to be home here where the palm and olive mingle. As I was trying to frame this lecture, an admittedly foolish topic to try to address, the suppression and restoration of the Society in 45 minutes or so, a metaphor suggested itself to me, and that's the metaphor of Jesuit theater. As most of you know, in the early history of the Society, the theater was an integral part of Jesuit pedagogy. And so it occurred to me that using a theatrical metaphor might be a way to help us move through these very complicated stages. So I would like to present for your edification and amusement today the suppression and restoration Jesuit tragicomedy in 2 acts and an interlude. Act the first, Suppression, wherein Philosophes Regalis, Status, Jansenus, and Gallicans combat the Ratio Studiorum, the Paraguay Reductions, Ultramontane Laxist Assassins, and a great big real estate empire in a suspenseful drama. That will be followed by an entr'acte, wherein unfold the tragedies of a browbeaten pope, sad deaths, and salvation at the unexpected hands of a Tartar Tsarina and a Lutheran Lord of Prussia. And finally, Act the second, Suppression, wherein revolution, reaction, and return produce post-traumatic stress syndrome in a shell-shocked, chastened, and cautious company of Jesus. So let's launch right in. Act the first, Suppression. Every great drama and melodrama needs to have a villain. And here he is. Sebastião José de Carvalho e Meio, the Marquis de Pombal. The Marquis de Thank you, and I encourage audience participation throughout this discussion. Pombal was a perfect man of the Enlightenment, trained in the tradition of the philosophes. He was the Portuguese ambassador first to the English court, and then to the royal court in Vienna. So he was well educated in the traditions of the Enlightenment. Pombal was rabidly anti-clerical, and rabidly anti-church, and rabidly anti-Jesuit. He was against popes white and black. Now, that isn't to say he wasn't a man of his time. For example, let's see if we can get them on here. He understood something about nepotism. You will see him here surrounded by his brother, the patriarch, the Cardinal Patriarch of Portugal, and his other brother, who was the royal governor of Brazil. Now, the drama of the suppression begins with the War of the Seven Reductions, 1754 to 1756. At a moment long into the history of the reductions began when the Jesuits began to move the native peoples off of the coast and inland in what's the nexus of modern-day Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Argentina. By the time we get to the 1750s, those missions are doing well. Spain and Portugal decide they want to adjust some borders. They move about 30,000 Guarani out of their reductions, these new settlements in the wilderness. They were initially opposed by the Jesuits. The Jesuits were pulled out of the situation immediately. The Guarani rose up, and there were 1,500 deaths, a pattern that would be repeated, incidentally and parenthetically, in northern Mexico when the suppression gets there about 25 years later. So the people are relocated. Most of you have seen the mission, which conflates in a dramatic form, but a fairly accurate historical form, the main lines of the stories of the reductions. These idyllic, certainly paternalistic organizations of the native peoples in the wilderness, but at the same time they were looked on by some of the great thinkers of the time as being remarkably open and progressive. Montesquieu, even Rousseau, who hated the church, and even Voltaire, who was perhaps the unhappiest alumnus we ever had, who never sent in a pledge card, all of them saw this as a noble social experiment. The major reason for this, of course, was trying to keep the native peoples from being enslaved by the Portuguese and the Spanish warriors. War results, and the Jesuits are expelled, and a great deal of bad feeling is raised against the Jesuits on the European scene among the Enlightenment peoples. We add to that one of the oddities of history, that on the Feast of All Saints of 1755, a massive earthquake and a tsunami wiped out the city of Lisbon, the royal city of Lisbon. And as happens so frequently in cases like this, preachers arise in the pulpit to declaim the sin of the nation and to say that this is God's vengeance. And the most unfortunate and perhaps importunate of those preachers was Father Gabriel Malagrida, very aptly named Unhappy Shout. Father Malagrida claimed that this was God's wrath on this secularizing culture. Now, one step further. In 1758, 3 years later, there was an assassination attempt made on the King of Portugal, King Jose I, when the family of the king's mistress waylaid the king on his way back from an assignation. They were accused, tried, and killed, along with their Jesuit confessor, the unfortunate, unhappy, unlucky Father Malagrida. Father Malagrida was imprisoned for a period of about 3 years, during which time the poor man lost his mind. He was having visions. He was getting telephone calls from St. Anne. He had a whole chain of very odd experiences, which led finally to his murder in one of the last of the autos de fe that the Portuguese Inquisition, which was being run by Pombal's brother, incidentally, was able to stage in the city of Lisbon. Now, this points to a theme that comes up over and over again in literature, and that is Jesuits as regicides, or as assassins. The Jesuit assassin is a wonderful trope that goes throughout literature, starting really almost from the beginnings of the society and coming up into modern day. More on that later. Where does this come from? Well, there were Jesuit social theorists even early on in the history of the society. One of them was Juan de Mariana, who was writing just at the turn of the 17th century, who was silenced by Claudio Acquaviva, the fifth general of the society. He wrote surprisingly progressive things. He said, both the philosophers and theologians agree that the prince who seizes the state with force of arms and with no legal right, no public civil approval, may be killed by anyone and deprived of his life. It sounds like the consent of the governed, doesn't it? Now, technically, and I'm a Jesuit, so I have to make a Jesuitical distinction, he's not sanctioning regicide, he's sanctioning tyrannicide, which is a fine point, but we'll make it nonetheless. And it's enough to make the crowned heads of Europe quite nervous. If we look at the other social theorists of the time, the Jesuits, Bellarmine and Suarez, each were moving in the direction, in fact, were read by people like Locke later on about kings deriving their power from the governed as well as from God directly. However, this sets up a whole trope of Jesuits as assassins. Everybody knows that the Jesuits caused the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, common knowledge. Everybody knew that Queen Elizabeth the Jesuits attempted to poison Queen Elizabeth I by spreading a mixture of opium and arsenic on the saddle of her horse on a hot day. Everybody knows that we tried to kill James I, and that we were, of course, behind the Guy Fawkes Day bombing of the Houses of Parliament. Henry IV, our good friend King Louis XIV, there were rumors that the Jesuits tried to assassinate him. There were assassination attempts made on Louis XV, which were imputed to the Jesuits. More on that later. We already heard the story of Jose I. We have the Tsar of Russia, Alexander, in 1820. And of course, it's common knowledge, because everybody knows this from the internet, that Pope Clement XIV, who suppressed the society, was taken by a sudden illness suspected to be caused by poison administered by the Jesuits in 1774 and died shortly thereafter. What you may not know is that the pneumonia that was supposedly killed William Henry Harrison was actually a Jesuit fungus that took him off. That poor Zachary Taylor, whose death was attributed to eating too many cherries and too much ice-cold milk on the 4th of July, that was actually a Jesuit plot to poison him. That John Wilkes Booth was a Jesuit agent. That James A. Garfield was assassinated by a Jesuit agent, that Benito Juarez was killed by the Jesuits, that William McKinley was shot by the Jesuits. It's common knowledge that the Jesuits were behind the assassination of John F. Kennedy because he was trying to clamp down on the mafia, that the Jesuits tried to assassinate both Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II, that we did kill Pope John Paul I, and that there were any number of attempts made by Jesuits on their most successful and dramatically important alumnus, Fidel Castro. What you may not know is that the Jesuits, of course, caused the Great Fire of London. This is illustrated beautifully in a book called Pyrotechnica Loyolana, Jesuit Fireworks or the Fiery Jesuits' Temper and Behavior, published in 1667, the year after the Great Fire, which shows, among other things, Jesuits coming from all over the world to set fire to the city of London, and the Pope sitting on his throne in his tiara with a pair of bellows in his hand. You may not know, however, that Jesuits sank the Titanic in order to take over the world banking system, that Pedro Arrupe who was supposedly a physician, was actually a nuclear scientist, and it is he who blew up Hiroshima with a Jesuit-inspired atom bomb, and that Peter Hans Kolvenbach ordered the attack of 9/11. Interesting. These, of course, are the same regicides who, quoting another disgruntled alumnus, now John Donne, play princes like shuttlecocks. They work themselves into the courts, coaches, and councils of princes. They have found the use of the compass, and now have not patience to be fishers of men, but are merchants of kingdoms and pirates both of spiritual and temporal treasures. Arr! The secrets of all states and the passages of all courts had no other register than the breasts of Jesuits. Now, how did the Jesuits get to positions that invoke such hatred? Well, for one thing, the Jesuits became royal confessors and were immensely powerful in many of the courts, especially the Bourbon courts, up until the middle of the 18th century. The Jesuits were court confessors in Portugal until 1754, for example. They became more than keepers of the king's conscience. They were brokers in benefices. They became power politicians. Père Lachaise, for whom the famous cemetery in Paris is named, was a Jesuit and was a counselor to Louis XIV. In France, for example, during the reign of Louis XV, Madame Pompadour became one of the Jesuits' most virulent enemies because her Jesuit confessor wouldn't give her absolution when she confessed being the king's mistress, or even after she stopped being the king's mistress and then simply became the procurer of younger women for the king. So she developed, shall we say, something of an animus against the Jesuits. So the Jesuits called some of this on their own heads. So we get to 1759, 1,100 Jesuits, or more than 1,100 Jesuits, are exiled from the Portuguese kingdom, the first card to fall. Portugal, Africa, Macau, and Brazil. They were accused of disloyalty, of flaunting the authority of the Portuguese throne, of avarice, disturbing the peace of the realm, and for saying that port wine wasn't tasty enough to be used for the Holy Eucharist, which was probably the greatest sin of all. Meanwhile, in La Belle France, the eldest daughter of the Church, the Society of Jesus had always had a complicated relationship there. There were ancient traditions of Gallicanism, of favoring the power and the influence of the council over the papacy, Paris versus Rome, council over pope. In 1682, Louis XIV's regalist policy was underscored by a series of documents that he produced called the Gallican Articles, which insisted on the king's right to name bishops and a whole series of other limitations of papal power. Though Louis XIV, long-lived and long-reigning Louis XIV, was actually pro-Jesuit for most of his career. He founded the Collège Louis le Grand in Paris. If you haven't had a chance to read Judith Rock's wonderful novels that are set there, go out and find them. They're delightful. He had Jesuit confessors and advisors, and he supported the Jesuits in their opposition to Jansenism, about which more in a moment. But the history of this society in France was troubled from the very beginning. St. Ignatius, who studied in Paris before he came to Rome and was ordained, desperately wanted to get a college going in Paris. It was only at the end of his lifetime, he died in 1556, I think it was 1553, that he was finally able to get a Jesuit foundation on the outskirts of Paris. The French, ooh la la, tend to be xenophobic. They were certainly opposed to the ultramontanism, to use a modern word to describe the attitudes of the Jesuits' profound support for the Pope. They were opposed by the local parliaments. Parliament here not in the British sense, but parliaments as in the local systems of law courts. The Jesuits were seen as strongly royalist, as defenders of the status quo, when of course they weren't trying to assassinate the king. They came to control education for the upper and the upper middle classes for most of the 17th century in France. Yet their school system became ossified as time went on. They didn't and weren't able to adapt to the times in the 18th century, as the salon takes the place of the schoolroom as the place for active intellectual life and discourse. And there was an abortive attempt on Louis XV that was blamed on the Jesuits because the assassin, who was actually a Jansenist agent, had formerly worked for the Jesuits at the Collège Louis le Grand in Paris. Now, so far so good. We're holding on. The match on the powder keg is Père Antoine Lavalette, who is the 18th century Jesuit Bernie Madoff. What Father Lavalette causes can only be described as a perfect storm of big mistakes. Lavalette makes big plantation investments. He was a talented businessman on the island of Martinique. British corsairs, pirates, pick off the French cargo fleet. This is the period of the French and Indian Wars in American history. So the French and the British are fighting with one another. Lavalette engages in more risky land speculation, as speculators always do. If you get in a hole, you dig yourself in deeper. There were 4 detained or dead Jesuit emissaries who were sent to try to rein him in. He was finally brought back to France, exiled to England, kicked out of the society. And meanwhile, the lending houses of Marseille sued the Society of Jesus for huge losses based on all of the materials that went down or were stolen by the British from their fleet. The Jesuits can't pay it off. They don't have money enough to pay it off. The Jesuits compound the situation by making a bigger mistake. They countersued. Rather than finding the money and paying them off, they countersued, making the argument that there is a corporate veil in the constitutions of the Society of Jesus that separate each community from the whole body of the society, which gets the Jesuit constitutions brought into court for the first time. Meanwhile, the indolent and lukewarm Louis XV, against whom there has been an assassination attempt, turns against the Jesuits and against the Parliament. The Parliament, which was a hotbed of neo-Jansenists who detest the Jesuits. Now, to do terrible injustice to a very complicated theological series of arguments, let's talk a little bit about Jansenism. There are really 2 ways of looking at how God works out the salvation of the world. One is to see God's abundant and superabundant grace filling in for all human imperfections. The other is a more pessimistic view that comes out of deep roots in St. Augustine, looking at the absolute corruption of humanity and God's grace, which works in a predestined way, which we can't begin to understand. 2 great kind of polar figures in this argument are Luis Molina, Jesuit who died in 1600, who is one of the first great proponents of God's grace triumphing over human weakness and human nature. On the other side, Cornelius Jansen, an Orthodox Catholic who became Bishop of Ypres in what's modern-day northern France, Belgium. Jansen, who died in 1638, without publishing much in his lifetime because he knew that his teachings were skating very close to the edge of Calvinism. The Calvinists saw the Jesuits as huge enemies because the Jesuits were preaching God's grace and God's mercy. They saw Luis Molina as Morpheus in The Matrix, thank you, as offering a poison pill and an easy escape. Again, all this points to a theological fault line that has run down the middle of the tradition since the beginning, between free will and human action moving towards salvation, and to the very difficult and forever unsolved question of where does predestination fit into this? God's pre-knowledge of how we will or will not respond to God's grace. So the role of grace is the big question here. Pelagius says that we can work out our salvation. St. Augustine says it's only through God's prevenient grace. The question between the value of human works as opposed to grace and submission to the will of God. Molina on one side, Jansen and Calvin on the other side. Essentially, a battle between 2 worldviews. An optimistic worldview that the world can, in fact, and most of its inhabitants can be saved, as opposed to a rigorous, anti-laxist mindset. I will pass over that in square brackets. But the question is the question that the Church is debating in this very moment. It was one of the great themes of the Synod that just closed, or the first session of the Synod, wasn't it? Between God's mercy and hope, God's great and abundant forgiveness, and God's justice and judgment, between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. Is it a big boat, or is it a very small boat? Well, this sets up a series of contrasts between Jesuit philosophers, Jesuit theologians, and the Jansenists that would be played out across the space of the 17th and early 18th centuries. Irony of ironies, the Jansenists and the Philosophes band together. Bill O'Reilly gets in bed with Rachel Maddow. The Parliament burns Jesuit books, the Jesuit schools are closed, all of the old accusations against the Jesuits as sorcerers, as laxists, as treasonous, as regicidal are raised again. The king says, I've had enough of this. I'm simply going to change the constitutions. There will be a vicar for the society in France who has nothing to say to Rome, and I will force the Gallican Articles on the Society of Jesus, a solution which was resoundingly refused by Rome and by Clement XIII, the last papal friend of the society, who says in an unguarded moment, one of these wonderful lapidary Latin phrases, ut sint aut non sint. Either let them be or let them not be at all. So leave them alone or we're going to be forced to eradicate them. Well, people took those as fighting words and as daring words. Louis XV dissolves the society in France as obnoxious to civic order, a violation of the natural law, the destroyer of religion and morality, the perpetuator of corruption, although, unlike in Portugal, the Jesuits were allowed to remain as diocesan priests, and in many places they actually continued to live a very informal kind of community life with one another. D'Alembert, one of the great writers of the Encyclopédie, writes to Voltaire, an alumnus of Louis le Grand, let the Jansenist rabble rid us of the Jesuit blackguards. Do not put anything in the way as these spiders gobble one another up. The Jesuits were the regular troops, recruited and disciplined under the standard of superstition, the Macedonian phalanx, which it behooved reason to see broken up and destroyed. The Jansenists are merely the Cossacks, whom reason will make cheap work of once they have to fight alone. Very prescient and true words. Voltaire, writing to D'Alembert, écrasez l'infâme, let the infamous one be erased, wiped out. Once we have destroyed the Jesuits, we shall have a good hand against the detestable one, namely Mother Church herself. Parenthetically, Voltaire was not a heartless man. He took in one of his Jesuit professors from Louis le Grand and let him live up in the servants' quarters after the society was suppressed in France, not so much because he was charitable, but because he was the only person who could beat Voltaire at chess. Meanwhile, His Most Catholic Majesty of Spain caves in almost immediately. There is rioting in Madrid over what could be the silliest law ever done, the law of the sombreros, which told the proud madrileños that they couldn't wear capes and sombreros anymore because they were terrorist gear, to use a modern idiom. There were riots in the streets. The Jesuits were blamed for the riots, though in fact the Jesuits had originally tried to quell the riots. The ideas that are rolling back and forth from France and from Portugal are certainly alive in Spain. There is an extra added bonus here that the legitimacy of the king's birth is impugned. His mother, Isabella Farnese, or Elisabetta Farnese, was an Italian princess, and forged letters that were stuffed into the Jesuits' bags coming into Spain said that Carlos III, for whom there's a great brandy named also, Carlos III was the illegitimate son of her Jesuit confessor, an Italian Jesuit, and this Italian princess, and not the legitimate son. This, as one can imagine, puts the king's teeth on edge, and as the perfect storm continues to grow, he does something that's quite remarkable in history. He sends out secret letters to every royal governor in the Spanish Empire. Consider that the Spanish Empire is spread over all of South America and the Philippines. secret letters that are to be opened on a particular day under pain of death to anyone who opened them ahead of time, which said that the Jesuits were to be arrested, rounded up on April the 1st of 1767, shipped off to the Papal States, Corsica as it turned out, because the Pope wasn't willing to have another 5,000 people dropped on his doorstep, 2,700 from Spain, 2,300 from Latin America and the Philippines. Consider that the Jesuits in the Philippines, it took a year and a half for the letter to get to the Philippines. They were put on the Manila Galleon, sent across the North Pacific, down the California coast to Baja California, where they were imprisoned for 3 months on a stinking ship in the bay at Loreto, until they were finally transshipped into Mexico, marched across Mexico onto a ship in Veracruz, and then sent back to a nothing existence in Europe. Hundreds of these men died along the way. And it's a story of tremendous sadness and of suffering. Men who had spent their lives teaching and working in the missions were simply shut out of their houses with no support. Why? Well, interesting question. No direct charges. The reasons remained as the documents of suppression, for all practical purposes, were locked in the king's breast. No discussion was allowed under pain of treason. So, overnight, the Jesuits in the Spanish Empire were eliminated. Here we see the family tree of the Society of Jesus from a wonderful engraving from 1562. What happens? 1759, down goes Portugal. France, 1764. Spain, Naples, and Sicily, 1767.
It's going. Holy crap! The mark!
We don't know whether the voice saying "holy crap timber" was a Jansenist, was Pombal, or a philosophe. Maybe it was all three. Time for an entr'acte, at which point in the pre-suppression society hot chocolate would have been served. In fact, the Jesuits were crazy about hot chocolate, and in fact, one of the chroniclers at the time that the society was suppressed in Italy says that the only things the Jesuits were allowed to take with them when they were kicked out of their houses were their breviaries, their tobacco, and their hot chocolate. And he said that the loss of the hot chocolate would kill half of them because they had hot chocolate twice a day. So, two unfortunate men caught in the squeeze. Clement XIV, Lorenzo Ganganelli, a conventual Franciscan who was elected to the papacy in 1769 and ruled until 1775, and the last superior general of the early society, Lorenzo Ricci, who was general from 1758 until 1773, and who died in 1775. Two men who were too small for the times. Giulio Cesare Cordara, who was a Jesuit historian and a counselor to both, he knew Clement XIV as a cardinal and was a counselor and a friend of Lorenzo Ricci, describes the two of them this way. He says of the Pope, he would have made an excellent Pope had his lot fallen on easier times. Cordara on the general, I would have judged him most competent to guide the society on a quiet and tranquil sea, but because of his gentle nature, I felt he was less well equipped to be at the helm amid violently tossing waves. Two relatively sweet and even-tempered men up against this crowd. The French ambassadors on the left, our friends the Pombal brothers on the top, and then the Spanish ambassadors. We have killed the son, one of them says. Now nothing remains for us to carry out like actions against the mother, our Holy Roman Church. So, 1769, after what is arguably one of the most corrupt conclaves in the history of the Church, and that's going some distance to say that, Clement XIV, the only religious cardinal in the conclave, is elected Pope. he's a vacillating man. He tries in small ways to protect the Society of Jesus in the first few years of his papacy. Yet the power of the Bourbon family compact, remember that Louis XV and Carlos III are cousins, who are trying to see to the end of the society. The only wild card out there for them is Maria Theresa of Austria, a very devout Catholic, but she has an agenda of her own. She wants to marry her little daughter Antoinette to the Dauphin in France, Louis, who would become Louis XVI, the grandson of Louis XV. So she doesn't put an obstacle in the way. So the vice is tightened harder and harder on the unwilling and weak Ganganelli. The ambassador, Monino was his name, threatens the Pope that, fine, you don't get rid of the Jesuits, we will go into schism the same way that the English went into schism. We will declare that the church is independent in Spain and in France. We will call a church council to depose you unless you publish a simple little document called Dominus Ac Redemptor, which was composed largely by the Spanish ambassador. Not a papal bull, but a papal brief, 48 paragraphs long. Why a brief and not a bull? Well, because it only took 2 signatures. It could be kept secret more efficiently than a bull which required more passings through hands in the papal court, in which no formal charges were waged against the Society of Jesus, except that sometimes it's necessary to get rid of older religious orders that are no longer useful to the church, citing the examples of some orders that had 15 members that were put out of business. Consider that at the time of the suppression, the Society of Jesus was the largest religious order in the church. It had more than 20,000 members all over the world. Why? Well, it's necessary for the peace of the church. That's why. And all were forbidden to oppose, attack, write against, or even speak of it, the suppression of the society, as to its charges or motives under the pain of automatic excommunication. Period. End of statement. Lorenzo Ricci and his assistants were arrested a month later after taking refuge from the Jesuit at the English College. They were imprisoned for 2 years without a trial in Castel San Angelo, where Ricci's health was broken. He was chained facing a wall. He couldn't even look out the window for the last 2 years of his life. He died in 1775, just weeks before Pius VI was ready to set him free, professing his innocence and professing his obedience to the Holy See. A remarkable document of faith. So, dead and buried? Well, not quite. Here, one of the wonderful ironies of history plays itself out. You see here a graphic showing the partition of Poland, which happened at just this moment in history. The Tsarina, Catherine the Great, is negotiating with Frederick the Great of Prussia and Joseph I of Austria to divide up Catholic Poland. Well, here we go. An unlikelier pair of saviors you would never want to find. Frederick the Great of Prussia says the Pope became executioner of his own bodyguard. Writing to the Pope, I have guaranteed the status quo of the Catholic religion in Prussia. I have never known better priests. I will add that since I belong to the class of heretics, the Pope may not dispense me from my obligation to keep my word nor my duty as an honest man and a king. Nya, nya, nya. Writing to Voltaire, who was a personal friend of his and whom he had accommodated in his palace in Prussia, the monk Ganganelli, Clement XIV, has trimmed their claws, drawn their teeth, and left them in a condition in which they can neither scratch nor bite, but merely impart learning to the young, at which art they are better than all the others. Well, let's move further east. Semiramis of the North, combining, as one historian put it, very feminine flexibility and very Tartar will. has the governor recall all the copies of the brief Dominus Ac Redemptor to prevent its promulgation. The catch in a papal brief is that it goes into effect when it is read to the people to whom it is addressed. She refused to allow to have the brief spoken to the Jesuits. The Jesuits say, Your Majesty, we know that this is out here. We're obedient sons of the Church and followers of St. Ignatius. You must allow this. She tells them to buck up, stop whining, and get back into their classrooms and teach their students. She threatens the Pope with the forced conversion of all the Roman Catholics, not only in Poland, but in Russia, to Orthodoxy if they're not allowed to open a novitiate. And in fact, from that novitiate, the society was slowly regenerated in Polotsk. And the society hierarchy survived in Russia until 1820, when it was kicked out by Tsar Alexander. I have to show you these images just because they're so wonderfully charming. Here you see Catherine the Great on the left, who is disguising the Society of Jesus as a veiled lady with a beretta on, with the IHS burning on her bosom. And over on the right, you see the Empress having the church dress a young Jesuit as a secular priest so that he can go on about his business. So, in the rest of the world, almost 800 colleges close. Libraries and art collections are ransacked. The Jesuits fall to the whim of local authorities. Yet, at the same time, 46 Jesuits in the 35-year period of the Suppression were made bishops around the world, including one, John Carroll, who was in Flanders at the time of the Suppression. In America, the 15 or 20 Jesuits who were in the Maryland province formed a corporation, the Society of Roman Catholic Gentlemen of Maryland. They held on to Jesuit real estate and continued to serve as diocesan priests, John Carroll becoming the first Archbishop of Baltimore. What do? They do what Jesuits always do, what Jesuits know best. They submitted a proposal for establishing an academy at Georgetown on the Potomac River in Maryland in 1789, just as the U.S. Constitution is being established, and the discussions for putting the capital about a half a mile down the river are on that same Potomac River are being drafted. And as the trauma of the French Revolution spreads across Europe, the calls for the restoration of the Jesuits begin to be heard. It's a period of immense trauma for believing Catholics. 2 popes were exiled, imprisoned, and desperately humiliated. Pius VI, who was a decent man, ended up dying in southern France, in Valence, in exile. He's hustled out of Rome in a stagecoach. Even more humiliating, of course, is the story of Pius VII, who was forced by Napoleon to come to Paris for his coronation, and then Napoleon plucks the crown out of his hands and crowns himself to show that the power is coming from the state and not from the church. And what may be the most tragic portrait ever done of a pope is David's sketch of the tired, worn Pius VII in the nude, sitting on his throne, as this preliminary sketch for this acre-wide. The original canvas of this at Versailles is about the size of this back wall here. So, all over? No. Time for the restoration, and I will bring the ship into port. Act the Third, Restoration. On August 7th of 1814, 4 months after Napoleon is exiled to Elba, while he's still on the island of Elba, His Holiness Pope Pius VII restores the Society of Jesus universally. Now, the Society had been allowed in some small places, besides Russia, to come back into an informal existence. In the United States, in 1805, in some of the duchies of Italy in that same period, 1805 to 1810 or so. There were maybe 600 Jesuits left in the world when Solicitudo Omnium Ecclesiarum is published in August of 1814, exactly 200 years ago. A document which is remarkable to hear, especially when we put it up against what we heard before. With one voice, the Catholic world demands the reestablishment of the Society of Jesus. We would believe ourselves guilty before God of great error if among these great dangers to the Christian Republic we neglected the help God granted us by God's special providence, if we, placed in Peter's bark, rocked and assailed by continuous storms, refuse to make use of the vigorous and tested oarsmen who offer themselves up spontaneously to break the force of the sea that threatens us at every moment with shipwreck and death. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. A remarkable turnabout in a short period of time. Why? Well, because the world had changed, and it changed in a way that no one could have imagined or kept up with. Not everyone is happy with this. I do not like the reappearance of the Jesuits. Shall we not have regular swarms of them here, in as many disguises as only a king of the gypsies can assume, dressed as printers, publishers, writers, and schoolmasters? If ever there was a body of men who merited damnation on earth and in hell, it is the Society of Loyolas. Nevertheless, we are compelled by our system of religious toleration to offer them asylum. John Adams, writing to Thomas Jefferson, who writes back with somewhat less florid rhetoric, but echoing the same thoughts. So here we are, 1814, at the beginning of what John O'Malley rightly calls the long 19th century. A century which is punctuated by ongoing revolutions, by social upheavals, by instability for Europe and in the United States. Jerry, I'm delighted to see my friend and mentor, Jerry McKevitt here, who is going to do a talk in April. I strongly encourage you to come and hear that. It's a brilliant analysis of the Restoration and how it played itself out in the Jesuit colleges of North America. The society did better, oddly enough, in North America than it did almost anywhere else, probably because of the lack of history, but that's a topic for another day. My thesis is that the Jesuits rose from the dead on the wrong side of the tomb and on the wrong side of history. They reemerged in the shadow of the Congress of Vienna in a climate of nostalgia for stability, for reunion of throne and altar, in a mindset of restorationism and a ferocious ultramontanist attitude that only the papacy could bring stability to a world that had gone mad in the revolutions of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Unfortunately, the Jesuits, as they were restored, most of them were older. Many of them had been terribly traumatized. They were blinded to the positive values of freedom, of republicanism, of democracy that came out of the movements of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. They had allowed themselves to be boxed into the corner of the Ancien regime. It's not too much to say that they were shell-shocked, that the society had lost its spontaneity, its sure-footedness, the elan vital that so characterized the early years of the society, especially the first 150 years from 1540 until plus or minus 1700 or so. That long 19th century perdured, certainly with all kinds of little pockets of light going through the early 20th century and mid part of the 20th century up until Vatican II. Without going through exhaustive detail here, you can read the stats here on the screen for yourself, simply to say that as the Jesuits were restored over and over again during the 19th and early 20th centuries, they were restored and expelled and restored and expelled. The general had to leave Rome 5 different times, and for 22 years the headquarters of the society was in Fiesole, in the hills above Florence. Expelled from Russia, expelled and returned from Spain, from Portugal, from Belgium, from Mexico, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Colombia. The Jesuits were expelled from Switzerland until 1973, when a rousing 54% of the very liberal Swiss population said that maybe it would be okay to allow Jesuits to come back into the country. In the Kulturkampf of Bismarck, Germany expelled them as well in 1872 through 1917. France, the situation is just as dire, in and out and in and out and in and out. Lest you think that everything was rosy here in the United States, I cite just the first paragraph of a wonderful book that's available on Google Books by John Claudius Pitrat, written in 1851, a date that should sound familiar to us here at Santa Clara, 1851. Mr. Pitrat writes in his book called Americans Warned of Jesuitism, Americans, the Jesuits who fill the Roman Catholic churches, invade your colleges and educate your children, who are scattered everywhere in the richest cities of the United States, who are in Oregon, in California, wherever money is made, whom you meet aboard the steamboats and the railroads with a studied smile, eyes cast down, very modestly dressed, and with the most reserved posture, looking so humbly, are those men whose organization, education of their houses of novitiate, doctrines and teaching, past and contemporary history, I shall summarily expose to you. And it goes on like this for a couple hundred pages. So, to summarize, why did this happen? Why did the suppression, why did the Jesuits fall? Cordara says very plainly the Jesuits got too big for their britches. They got too rich and too powerful. They forgot the simple message of the gospel, a message which Francis I continues to remind us of today. The last gasp of the Jansenists in Europe certainly was a nail in the coffin. Enlightenment attitudes and philosophy, the secularism that moved from a statist to a Republican governmental understandings certainly plays a major part. That the throne and the altar can no longer be united, especially when there's no longer a throne. The changing educational landscape to which the 18th century Jesuits, the late 18th century Jesuits, were not ready to adapt themselves. Ultramontane attitudes and diminished papal authority certainly played a terrible part. And this move from regalism of the late 17th, early 18th century into statism and finally republicanism was a pill that was just too bitter for them to swallow. What was the response of the restored Jesuits? Diminished resources and terribly bruised egos. They were scared to death. They were afraid it was going to happen again, and they didn't want to put their heads above that foxhole. More than that, they became reactionary. They became cautious. It's not too strong of a word to say they became Philistines. The rich tradition of the arts in the society was never recaptured, and maybe it's being recaptured now from Pedro Arrupe and on. There is not a great piece of Jesuit architecture or art or music from... the only really great Jesuit artist of the 19th century is Jared Manley Hopkins, whose poetry was never published in his lifetime, and who said in a heartbreaking letter, "Brilliancy does not suit us." The society removed itself from active philosophical and theological discourse, embracing a very rigid form of Thomism, and helped Leo XIII to draft the documents that enshrine Thomism as the only legitimate philosophical platform and theological platform for the Church. They didn't keep up with pedagogical change. Jerry will talk about that in his brilliant lecture, talking about the tensions that marked Santa Clara and USF and schools all over the United States, as the old classical model of education simply was no longer deemed appropriate for this new world. They became ever more rigorous defenders of the papacy, helping to draft the Syllabus of Errors, becoming drafters of some of the early versions of the First Vatican Council, and allying themselves in very large part in this long 19th century and into our own times, at least within living memory, to a very conservative branch of very careful Catholicism. So there you have it. 10 facts you must know about the Jesuits. If you want to know more, I strongly suggest you go on the internet and you buy a wonderful DVD called The Jesuit Conspiracy, Rome, the Church, and the Kingdom of the Antichrist, available for only $14.95. Or you can find out about the Black Pope and his world-ruling cabal, his world world-ruling Jesuit priests of Baal, who apparently are also in charge of Queen Elizabeth. Just lest you want to have some clarity on where the Jesuits' power works, it starts in the Vatican, it goes to the Jesuits, then they're in charge of the Illuminati, the Club of Rome, the Council of Foreign Relations, Opus Dei, international bankers, the Masons, the Mafia, and the New Age movement, all of which we can't really tell you about because we'd have to kill you. And of course we know now that that's all been totally verified by the election of Jorge Bergoglio, who is seen here between the seal of the Society of Jesus and the Masonic emblem. And we know that he is the Antichrist. How? Because all we have to do is turn his coat of arms upside down, and we find that it is a perfect replica, except where it isn't, of the mask of Beelzebub. It's amazing how this stuff lives on, isn't it? There's a charming piece in the Jesuit Post done by young Jesuits after one of the interviews with the Pope, when it was claimed that there were 6 Jesuit spies in the Vatican. The Pope is here saying, New York Times knows about the 6 mysterious Jesuit spies. Father Nicholas is saying, good, that means 3 are still safe. On a serious note, this is a tremendously complex and in some ways heartbreaking story. Yet just last month, on the 27th of September, as the society around the world joined with the Holy Father, joining with the General and the Jesuit leadership in Rome at the tomb of Ignatius, this is what the Pope said. And listen for the echoes of what you've already heard from Sollicitudo. The ship of the society has been tossed about by the waves, and there is nothing surprising in this. Even the bark of Peter can be tossed about today. The night and the powers of darkness are always near. It is tiring to row. But Jesuits must be brave and expert rowers, as Pius VII already said. So row then. Row and be strong even with the headwind. We row in the service of the Church. We row together. And he's addressing all of us, not just the collared members. And while we row, we all row. Even the Pope rows the boat of Peter. We must pray hard. Lord, save us. Lord, save your people. The Lord, even if we are men of little faith, will save us. Let us hope in the Lord. Let us always hope in the Lord. Thank you for your attention. We have time for a few questions. We have microphones here if anyone has questions, observations, disagreements. The better, the more the better. Please. Any observations, questions? Yes, Paul.
I read this earlier on. A few years ago, I read a book by Howard Berman, Law and Revolution. And in it, Berman speaks of the medieval popes who in their revolution established the first bureaucracy in Europe because there was nobody else to do it. And you wind up with the gradual rise of the nation state. And Berman, in an interesting footnote, said that basically, who's to blame for the rise of the nation state? It's the Vatican, for God's sakes. Well, it's a reaction. Well, over the centuries, the papacy has been transnational. Mm-hmm. And in being transnational, in many ways, it stands against all of modern history. Now, there's all sorts of complexities that are behind it, but, and I know I'm speaking too broadly, but that problem is still ours. The sovereign nation state is one of the major problems that exist in the world today. Mm-hmm. And the papacy, although it's a little bitty sovereign nation state, nobody really thinks of it as a world power. Mm-hmm. And yet, in some ways, it stands against that nationalism that is part and parcel of who we are. Is any of that mixed up in all of this?
I have to think about that. That's a very complicated question. What is significant, I think, is that the Society of Jesus was, in many ways, the first transnational large organization in service to the church. I mean, there were Franciscans everywhere, but the Jesuits at the very beginnings, and they prided themselves on that they came from all over and they were ready to go anywhere to do anything. That was part of the threat that the Jesuits provoked as well. The people in Latin America, in the reductions, weren't just Spaniards or Portuguese. There were German organ builders and sculptors and theoreticians as well. So I would have to think more about that, because I don't want to go out on that limb, because I think it's dangerous water to talk about something you haven't considered. Certainly, the two oldest corporations in the world are the Chinese Empire and the Roman Catholic Church. There's no getting around that, and that's why watching Paul and I have had some experience working in China in recent years, watching the interplay between the two of us. It's like watching two old men play mahjong with each other. You know, every 50 years or so, they tip the table over and they yell at each other, and then they come back and they sit down and play again. But I think that the transnationality of the Jesuits was certainly a source of a lot of concern on the parts of the crowned heads of Europe because of the flexibility. But I wouldn't want to go further than that. Anyone else? Yes?
After the suppression, and when the Jesuits were allowed to come back again, how did they recruit younger members? Mm-hmm. If the members who came back were older, mm-hmm. shell-shocked, and really shaken by this whole thing?
Mm-hmm. Well, there were still a lot of devout Catholics in Europe, and they were teaching their children that the church was under great stress and great danger and needed people to move ahead. The Jesuits had, for want of a better word, well, you use Chris Lowney's word, they had traditions of heroic leadership. And those traditions lived on in people's minds, and some of those were passed on to the younger generation. So it was no less than the early society when young Jesuits were encouraged to go out and become martyrs. So too, there was a strong heroic bent in a lot of these guys. You look at the people who came to California here. They were a remarkable bunch in Oregon. You know, they came to Oregon first, and then Father Colty and Father Nobley, in a wonderful act of disobedience, got on the steamer and came down here because they knew that this is where the action was. And caused actually big rifts in the local community, the Jesuit community as well. Those were people who were highly educated, but as Jerry points out so well in his book, Brokers of Culture, they were able to negotiate across these lines because they themselves had the experience, and differently here than being a French Jesuit going back into France, where there was 300 years of clotted up history that one had to deal with. Here, it was in some ways much easier, and the democratic traditions made it more possible for the Jesuits to have some flexibility and some wiggle room. Mike Zempelli and I were just at a conference in Chicago where some of these themes came up, and it's the historiography of the society up through 1700 or so has been done exhaustively. It's amazing how little has been written about the 19th century, almost nothing. And it's only in the last 15... When I joined the Jesuits 35 years ago, there was nothing except for a half a chapter in one book in English that I could find, because I was interested in this question. Now a lot more has been done, but there's a lot more yet to be done. But the church was in very bad condition in the beginning of the 19th century with the revolutions and the constant overthrow of the hierarchies, and so it was a time that required real daring on the part of the people who were engaged. Yes?
It's striking how the suppression as a historical event anticipates, if you will, anticipates the way in which all of these revolutions are sort of begin to roil across Europe, mm-hmm. affecting many of this, if not the same actors with the same offices in church and society. Mm-hmm. So it just seems it's striking from your presentation that there's this one event and then all these other things kick into place. And I'm not suggesting there's a causal relationship, but it's mm-hmm. striking nonetheless.
Yeah, well, I think what it points to is the profound instability of the world at that moment, from the middle of the the 18th century on, that the world was ready for new ideas. And unfortunately, those new ideas came with a lot of bloodshed, less bloodshed here in America, but if you look at the revolutions of Europe, the history of France in the 19th century is a nightmare. Every 15 years, the whole thing gets turned over and boils up again. So this is, in microcosm, this shows, and it also shows what happens when you have stable institutions that are destabilized. Certainly. The church was a very stable institution. The Society of Jesus, with the biggest manpower body in the Roman Church, when it's put out of business, a lot of things came loose at the edges. The Indians in Sonora, they rose in rebellion, and 2,000 of them were killed because they were supporting the Jesuits rather than the Spanish troops. So it's a very complex story. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate it. I can hang out here for a few minutes if anybody else has questions. It's so nice to be back home here, to see so many familiar faces. I'm looking at old friends and teachers. Charlie Phipps back here is I have to applaud him. I wouldn't be here today without Charlie Phipps, who was the first person ever to pop the question to me in 1972. Have you ever thought about being a Jesuit, Tom? And I said, absolutely not. And he says, well, you ought to. And so here we are all these years later. So thanks to all of you. It's wonderful to be back here at where the palm and olive mingle. Thank you.